Hey, this is John. Let's Talk Native is now on Patreon. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. We will be producing exclusive content for our Patreon supporters. Thanks for checking us out.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of Indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sago, and welcome to the program. Hey, this is not a spirituality show. So I'm not contradicting my intro here. I'm going to title this show is God is Not Red. And look, I'm not condemning Vine Deloria's book whatsoever, but the point I wanted to make, and this was raised by a few people, is how did this concept of God or Creator in much the same vein become so much a part of Native people, Native culture, Native communities? And I want to address it because this is not a Native concept. So when I say God is not red, what I'm saying is that it's not a concept that is ours. The whole idea of this humanizing of the power of creation, or even the idea of a deity, it's not a Native thing. And I'll explain it. And I'll explain some of the difference, but I'll also talk about how it came. How it's kind of beyond Native people becoming Christians themselves, outright, self-proclaimed Christians. Even many of our traditions and our stories have been altered in such a way, or at least the interpretation of our stories have been altered in such a way that it shows the influence. And because it shows the influence, and because it has been influenced, it is taken away from the real meaning of some of our stories, or even our ceremonies or festivals. So again, let me reiterate this idea of a man in the sky, this all-knowing, all-seeing, all-hearing, all-powerful, all-hearing man, person, God, whatever. It's not our concept. It doesn't exist in any of our stories. We do have creation stories, and the creation stories vary from peoples to peoples. And if what I'm saying here contradicts your creation story, I'd like to hear about that a little bit. But it doesn't contradict the Haudenosaunee one. And without going through and explaining the creation story, first off, let me say it's a story. For anybody who says they try to take these stories literally, then they're probably not quite understanding the purpose of the stories. And so when we tell a story, it's supposed to teach a lesson. The reason we do storytelling, the reason we always have done that as a part of our history and our culture, is to teach something. It is not to document history. These are not historical accounts. In fact, we would argue that at the dawn of our creation, we hadn't yet developed storytelling, skill yet, or even language necessarily. So there's some real problems with the notion that our creation story is a true account of our of our origin stories. They're meant to teach a lesson, and oftentimes they are a metaphor. Our creation story, and if you think about it, it's kind of a metaphor for childbirth. The idea of coming through, as they say, sky world, and then, water and all of that, and the idea that that sky woman would be grabbing onto certain plants or whatever else. It's the same thing that as a child, as we're born, we're bringing some of that DNA from our ancestors, from not just from our mother and father, but from a deeper genetic ancestry. So, I mean, my interpretation, the way it's been explained to me, is that the Haudenosaunee creation story is essentially a metaphor for the creation of each and every one of us, through our births. So, but there's something that you involve in that story, so it teaches lessons. And again, creation stories and most of our stories were meant for children. And I'm not trying to sound condescending or in any way, shape, or form, but to tell these stories is to kind of ground our understanding of our place within creation. Now, so again, as I said before, there is no figure in our creation story or in any part of our culture, at least originally, that talks about a great and all-powerful, all-knowing, deity, God, creator. There's nothing in our culture that suggests that we need to pray to a creator or pray to, make requests, pray for some sort of divine intervention by an all-powerful being. There's nothing in our look. Even the part of the creation story that gets into the right-handed and left-handed twin, and again in the story, creating so much that's around us. It's about balance. It's about harmony. It's about the right-handed twin creating something that may be on its face beautiful, but wouldn't exist without having a little bit of an edge to it. You put a thorn with the roses or with the berries, so all the berries don't get eaten, and those berries not only provide something for us to consume and others to consume, but as it represents part of propagating itself through seeds and that kind of stuff, that they don't all get consumed. So, and there's so much, whether you add, turbulence and rocks and current to a stream, so you don't have a peaceful body of water that will stagnate and become, essentially a spoiled or uninhabitable body of water. All of these things. In our story, we talk about the right-handed twin creating something and the left-handed twin creating something where together they complement each other. Now, what happens with this idea of introducing Christian concepts even to our stories, we end up embodying this notion of a creator, and we even capitalize it in the same way Thomas Jefferson did in the Declaration of Independence, endowed by their creator, and OR even gives it a masculine connotation to it. And some people will argue whether that's true or not, but in the end, or usually that's what the having an OR instead of just creator with the ER would be. So again, you masculinize this power of creation. You humanize it. You create it into a human-like God. And then we start interchanging the word creator with God as if somehow that makes the God concept more native. And it doesn't. And again, I'll go through some of it. As I talked about, when this whole idea of Christianity starts to influence how we frame our own, cultural teachings, our stories, and that kind of stuff, even the left-handed and the right-handed twin, it ends up turning into like a good versus evil construct. And some would argue that the left-handed twin was evil and the right-handed twin was good. I've talked about this before on previous shows. Even the word, the Latin word for left is sinister. and it has to do with, even parting the sky as far as good and evil, the good parts of the sky being on the right, and the evil being on the left. So in many European cultures, the idea of somebody who was left-handed would be taboo. Like that was, an evil characteristic. And so that's not what our story did. Our story didn't take and make the left-handed twin evil. It just it added some sharpness and some contrast and maybe a little adversity, but not necessarily something that was meant to be characterized as the good versus evil construct. So, and this is what's happened, with this influence of Christianity coming to our shores. And look, I've heard people argue that the genocide that would follow Christopher Columbus was part and parcel an effort to convert us. I never bought into this whole idea that this was about white people trying to convert us to be good Christians like them. And in fact, even in Stephen Newcomb's film, The Doctrine of Discovery, Unmasking the Domination Code, he and his guest Rivera talk about that even when Native people were converted, they were only converted barbarians. They were never converted to this notion that they were somehow equal to other Christians. So this whole idea that Christianity would bring this hierarchy construct also, and that there were levels of humanity even within those who could grasp their concept or be indoctrinated into their concept of Christianity. There was this notion of hierarchy. In fact, the role the church played even with monarchies. I mean, it was the church that would ultimately bestow the ultimate authority. This word sovereign that I've talked about before. The word sovereign suggests that this was an extension of God bestowing power on royal families or on a monarchy or whatever else, and that there was a relationship between the power to rule man, a man's power to rule man, and God's approval or sanctioning of that through the church. This is where the church played such an integral part of creating these hierarchical and male dominant structures that would and I'm not saying that Christianity did this all by itself. Other cultures, the other two major religions have much of the same characteristics, I guess. But Christianity is almost singular in the way it is, and Catholicism, as the base or the foundation of even all the Protestant denominations, stands is marked by being the most domineering, oppressive, and authoritarian of all of the denominations of Christianity. I'm not saying that there aren't stricter forms of Christianity, some that are much more oppressive, but in terms of there being an authority, in terms of the Vatican and the Pope and that hierarchical structure that is associated with positions within the church, that's what I'm talking about there. There are still some very, very prudential, I guess, I don't know, puritanistic forms of Christianity that that still exist, without getting into naming specific denominations, but they certainly do exist. Some that are very much more oppressive towards women in particular, or accepting any progressive thoughts or ideas about equality and justice and that kind of thing. But again, as Christianity would begin to influence our people, and one of the ways that they would do it, not only were they proselytizing via the sword in terms of really murdering people and trying to convince them that their salvation was only going to be by accepting their views. Understand that the view that came from the Vatican through the papal bulls was that if you were not a Christian, then you were automatically an enemy of Christ. And so that's the way they could justify whatever treatment a Christian nation would would impose upon a non-Christian or a pagan people. And so once you've deemed that somebody is your enemy, you can justify all kinds of things: slavery, murder. I don't know how the rape culture it fits in with this Christian domination, but they seem to have gone hand in hand. And so for all of the the biblical Ten Commandments stuff, the idea of raping people seemed to fit in quite nicely with much of the Christian domination that would be involved with colonization. But yeah, so the whole idea that native people in particular, it wasn't just that they would view our beliefs as satanic. There was a lot of that, but they would view our beliefs as casting us as their enemies. Because if we didn't adopt their beliefs, then we had to be enemies of their religion and so enemies of them. And that's how they could justify the murder, and then use the threat of murder and violence as a way to, as a purely survival skill or tactic that people would accept Christianity. It was the only way they could survive, and that's why the spread of Christianity among the indigenous people in North, South, Central America, it was driven at the end of a sword. Now, it was also disease and illness was also a big part of it. So to the extent that Europeans came not only with diseases, but with some treatment and cure for some of those diseases, they would hold back those cures or treatments and say that you couldn't be cured unless you converted. And so this idea that God was punishing you with these diseases became, again, just like the sword and just like violence, disease was used in the same way. So this is what our people experienced. And so even as our people tried to parallel some of our cultural practices with theirs, that would still be rejected by true Christians. But it wouldn't stop some of our people. So what would happen in our communities, there would be some grabbing a hold of or assimilation into Christian beliefs, while still hanging on to some of our cultural beliefs. And this is not just true with Haudenosaunee. You see this in Mexico and Central America and South America, many indigenous communities that even as they became somewhat Christianized by colonization, they would not and actually refused to reject some of their, I hate to even call them belief systems. One of the things that I have to talk about is the idea of faith. By definition, faith is the idea of promoting or believing in something that is unprovable. That's the dictionary definition. It's believing in something that you cannot prove, and it's not that you can't prove it. It's just that it's unprovable. I mean, it's impossible to prove. Does God exist? Look, scientifically, it's impossible to prove. In fact, all of science would suggest that God doesn't exist. Even though the whole concept of creationism and all of your intelligent design, all that stuff. There's no way to prove it. Now, we can argue whether you can disprove it or not. I mean, it's like, how do you disprove a negative? I mean, it's a kind of circular reasoning, so to speak. But so faith is this idea that you believe in something because somebody told you to believe it. And they tell you that this is the way it has to be. You must believe something. You must believe in God. You must believe in the Bible. And that these are infallible truths that, although there's no evidence to support that these are infallible truths, in fact, there's probably much more evidence to suggest that it isn't, that faith is what has to drive not only your belief system, but your behavior. So the difference between native culture, even what I would call native beliefs, is that they are beliefs that are bound to provable circumstances. So the idea that if we put a seed in the ground and we believe that that seed is going to produce, corn or beans or squash or whatever. It's not faith, because we've done it before, and it's done, and it grows. Sometimes it doesn't. Every once in a while, we'll have some bad seeds, or we'll have bad weather conditions or climate conditions, and those seeds don't do what we think they should do. So that belief can be challenged, and so we have to develop better understandings about what we do with that seed. So it's not just the idea of poking your finger in the ground and putting a seed. Sometimes we have to cultivate, and we have to do certain things to make sure that that seed does what we want it to do. So it isn't just an act of God that makes that cornstalk come up. And it's not prayer that's going to make that seed produce food for us. So the idea that, so our culture, and even our creation stories, even our stories, are meant to be based and have some foundation in reality, even if the stories are somewhat a fantasy. So they are meant to reinforce some concept or some idea that once we are presented with that same circumstance, that may have that story may provide us a foundation. So as we encounter a circumstance, that story would have taught us something that will enable us to understand and turn what was previously a belief into knowledge. And the difference between belief and knowledge is what you experience, and a belief is what you were told. So faith is all about what somebody else is putting in your brain. And so they put these concepts in there, and oftentimes have to strip away something else to make room for that. And I'm not considering your brain like a jug with only so much room. But when in order to accommodate this idea of faith and belief, you almost have to put away something that doesn't conform to that faith or belief. So you have to almost dismiss knowledge, dismiss your personal experience, or you have to somehow recharacterize what your experience was to accommodate what that belief is. This is, a key component of what I talk about as far as cognitive dissonance, because we know that there are certain things that what faith is telling us doesn't conform to reality. And I'm not just talking about the idea of a heaven and angels and a hell and the devil and all of this stuff. I'm not even talking about those things, but much of the guidance that comes from that. Now, here's the other thing. The problem with there being not only this faith-based belief system imposed on other people, there are, as I said, there's hierarchy, and within that hierarchy are those people who we're led to believe have a better understanding. And in fact, the ultimate understanding is that they can tell you what God's words not only were or are, but they're going to tell you what they mean, because you may not be qualified to interpret what you've experienced. So somebody's going to tell you, okay, well, I know what you think you experienced. Let me explain it in a biblical fashion. Let me explain what God's words really mean and what you experience. So it's like when you lose a loved one. Well, it's because God wanted to take that person. Why? How does that make any sense? I mean, God had a need for my child. God had a need for a loved one who passed away while they were in the prime of their life. See, there's all of these ways that they twist a circumstance, and of course there's no way to prove that, and I guess there's no way to prove that it's wrong either, right? So this is what we experience with this notion that somebody else is going to interpret what your spirituality has to accommodate in terms of what you experienced in your life, how you deal with tragedy. So in many ways, because you're being convinced that there's this all-knowing, all-powerful, and in fact, not just all-powerful because God could make a plan for your life, that's God's plan, but that he actually has one, that somehow your life has already been charted for you by a deity, by a God. I, I've even heard native people buy into this notion that the moment we were created, our life was already charted out for us. That's a Christian concept. And a few other religions have that, but it's not ours. We, most of the teachings, the older teachings, are all about what creation provided for us to make rational decisions and to see, and to witness and experience what nature is guiding us towards, what the powers of creation guide us towards. Not just this idea that we need to somehow try to emulate, an image that was created of a God, and that we have to become godlike. This is, again, one of those areas that our culture talks about our relationship with creation rather than being the masters of creation, and that all of the creation was placed there for us. That's, again, even in the book of Genesis, they talk about subduing the creation, the creatures of the earth. All of the creatures, that's man's charge from God, according to that, to their belief system. That's not, we are never, there's nothing in our culture that tells us to subdue the earth, subdue the planet, subdue other life. These are conflicting beliefs. These are conflicting concepts. But the problem is this, the power that came with colonization and the violence that came with it, and the domineering control. I mean, Stephen Newcomb talks about the doctrine of discovery being the domination code, because it's all about domination. And it wasn't just meant to dominate us. It was meant to dominate the people of Europe and every place that they spread this concept. Look, we're going to take a break here and come back. And when I come back, I want to talk a little bit more about, examples of how not only has these Christian influences made it into our culture and the way we live, but how it basically has created most of the injustice that exists in the world today. And I think that is something that, if you are a nature-based culture, if you're a culture that understands the influences and, frankly, the conflicts that exist in nature, you understand how to accommodate those conflicts and how you create harmony with those conflicts. Not how you try to conform everything into a single belief. So we'll talk about that when we come back. Again, God is not red, and the concept is not ours. We'll talk about more of that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. Hey, let me give a shout out to my sponsors, to those who support the program on a weekly or a monthly basis that really help us do what we do here. Give a shout out to Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and the folks at Grand River Enterprises. I also want to give a props out to those who make a donation. We've got a few who've done some donations on PayPal, even a couple who've signed up for a monthly donation on PayPal. We occasionally get a check in the mail, and these are guys like Steve and VJ and Cindy, all of you who've made a contribution from time to time helps us to buy another piece of equipment. This is a brand new microphone, by the way. Help us buy another piece of equipment to improve what we're doing here, to give us more capability. Part of our goal is that we intend to shoot not just more short videos, but gear ourselves up towards doing a full-length documentary, and we've got a couple of concepts that we're kicking around and some things that we're putting some plans together. But part of that involves creating an adequate equipment list, and your donations, not just the folks who donate on a regular basis, but even those of you who who give support from time to time. You help us get to that next place. And of course, we also have to replace equipment from time to time. Some of the stuff gets old. We've been doing this for a long time. We are in our 11th year with Let's Talk Native, and we've moved towards having most of the equipment in-house as opposed to going to a radio station and doing a show. And so that puts more of that burden on us, a burden that we like to have because it gives us more control in what we're doing. So I want to thank all of you. I also want to do a special shout out to our Patreon subscribers. We are on Patreon, and if you go to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native, you'll see that we got a 2-tier system, and we do intend. In fact, we're putting some of the things in place now to create exclusive content for our Patreon subscribers, our Patreon members. So we'll be doing that, coming up soon. So again, I want to thank all of you who provide some level of support to what we're doing here. The other way that you guys support is by offering your comments and your commentary, sharing the programs, sharing the podcasts, sharing the videos, sharing the Facebook live streams and videos as well. We try to stay relevant. Part of what even today's show is trying to address issues that have been raised several times. And I know I've talked about some of these concepts before. In fact, what I'm going to talk about next is an example of something that I've talked about before, but it fits into this conversation. We have been influenced by European notions of spirituality. In fact, that's a word that I'm even troubled by. And I know Native people have really gravitated towards this idea of Native spirituality, but there's almost this idea that there's the natural and then there's a supernatural. I think there's enough in the nature basket, in the whole concept of understanding the natural, to even contemplate that there's something beyond or super or above what nature has, evidences to us every day. I think that's unnatural. Maybe because if there's natural and the supernatural has to fit into the unnatural category, and I kind of reject some of that. So this whole idea of spirituality has become not only a way that people try to separate elements of our culture, and they try to take some of our language and our ceremonies and some of our practices, and they take them out of context, and then they change them. And I've talked about our funerals before, and for us, when we talk about losing a loved one passing on, whether they are young or whether it's a violent occurrence or a tragic accident, or whether it's somebody who we've had the benefit of having their entire lives shared with us, what we refer to is that their bodies, they have returned to their mother. And so we talk about the earth, that we return to the very earth that produced us in the first place. We oftentimes refer to those faces unborn as being those faces that are still beneath the ground, that have not come out yet. So we actually create this analogy to a plant coming from the ground, as the same as a birth coming from our mothers. So when we die, we refer to that as returning to our mother. But see, because of Christian influences, now we hear more and more people, and I know some of you people are going to be a little offended by this. We say, that our loved one is making their final journey to the sky world, or to the Creator. That's not a part of our the way that we would have traditionally done funerals. We don't. I mean, the sky world isn't the native version of heaven, and the Creator, that is talked about in the way sometimes funerals are done today. They might as well plug God in heaven into there for Creator and sky world. But see, they've interchanged the concepts, and they've tried to do something that gives it the appearance of being more native. So we, instead of saying heaven, we say sky world, or instead of God, we say creator. But those concepts are exactly the same. They don't just parallel each other. One is an imitation of the other, and they aren't genuine to our culture. Look, even the idea of the stars. Look, when we do the Ohundu Guriwatekwa, we offer our appreciation and acknowledgement to those stars. We call them our cousins, our distant cousins, our most distant relatives. But we don't say that those are our ancestors. That's Disney and Lion King that does that. And so anybody who saw a cartoon and then incorporated this concept into, somehow, that makes the sky seem like heaven, and those stars up in the sky, are proof that that's where we go when we die. That's not at all part of our culture, but it's the way our culture has been manipulated. And I got to tell you, there's a whole lot more people who, when they, their families are telling people about them passing away, they recount this journey to the sky world. Now, I know some just say making their final journey, but in our culture, Haudenosaunee culture, we talk about our loved one has returned to their mother. And again, not their physical mother, but to the mother that bears us all, the earth. That's an example of how this thing's been twisted around. Now, I am not a follower of the Code of Handsome Lake, but I know plenty of people who are, but I also know, but that's even an area that some, and I don't mean all, because I don't think it's a universal construct that Handsome Lake is just another form, or the Code of Handsome Lake is another form of Christianity. But some have done that. Some have taken that leap. In fact, I've heard some try to tell the story that in Handsome Lake's visions, he saw the Ganawida come back, the peacemaker, and that he had holes in his hands and in his feet. Literally, if not literally saying it, literally implying that the Ganawida and Jesus Christ are the same. We're the same person. Now, not everybody who follows the Code of Handsome Lake has taken that leap. In fact, I've talked to some people. No, there's nothing in the Gariwio in the Code of Handsome Lake that says that. Although there are plenty of believers in that who say that, and that's where it's troubling. Now, I will say there's little doubt that code, that religion that is born out of Handsome Lake's trip into an alcohol-induced coma, that it did track along some Christian lines. It talks about the devil. Now, the devil didn't exist in our culture. So when the Code of Handsome Lake introduces this idea of repentance and the devil and heaven and hell or any of that stuff, and I'm not going to pretend to be an authority on the Code of Handsome Lake, but you can tell that there was a Christian influence, whether it was on the person that was known as Handsome Lake himself, or those who have tried to interpret what Handsome Lake had explained, in his again in his dream sequences. But you can see where it comes from. Now, I know this is, when I talk about this kind of stuff, it ruffles some feathers. But there are clearly characteristics that have been drawn into this Handsome Lake religion that are not originally part of our culture. So there, and whether it was done by the elders who claim to be the bastions of knowledge that are associated with Gariwio, or whether it's some of their believers who have taken liberties. Either way, we know the liberties have been taken, and we know that some of this stuff creates confusion. And I think one of the things that happens with this whole idea that there is a God who has already, has a plan, and that our lives have already been charted out from, it takes away personal responsibility. And so look, there was a death, a couple of deaths that occurred a couple of years ago, and I heard one of the native speakers, talk about that this was it was intended that this was their day to die. Not look in our funeral ceremonies, we talk about that a person has lived all their days, but that isn't to imply that at the moment of their birth, the number of days they had was already charted out. Look, if you believe that, then it doesn't matter what you do. Your personal behavior isn't going to take your life. I mean, it violates logic. And when we lose people to things like drug overdoses or any kind of lifestyle choices that have endangered them, even now as we live in this pandemic, that is global. To suggest that somehow we don't need to worry about whether we get sick or not because it's either God's plan for us to live or die within the next 14 days or not. I mean, it takes away personal responsibility. Now, there's also this idea. I talked about domination. When part of one of the more famous biblical scriptures is read, and they talk about the meek shall inherit the earth. That is literally an attempt to pacify people to not rise up. Don't fight back. Don't resist. Just be meek and humble, because you will inherit the kingdom of God. So, in other words, take the slavery that is being imposed upon you. Take the injustices. Accept the murder. Accept the residential schools. Accept the oppression. Because that is preparing you for your seat in the holy kingdom. That's literally what they tell you. And that, again, it strips away not only personal responsibility, but it strips away the will to change. Look, I even heard Jeff Sessions, who was a part of when he was the U.S. Attorney General, suggested that it was a sin to stand up to governance, because if a government existed, and there's a Bible quote, there's a Bible quote for this that suggests that governments only exist because of God's will. So what Jeff Sessions was trying to suggest, that he and Donald Trump and all of these corrupt individuals, that they couldn't really be corrupt, because the fact that they are in government and the fact that they are a part of a government only exists because it's God's will that they exist. And that if you reject them, that you are defying God. That they literally were saying this crap. So this is the kind of stuff that a rational human being will challenge. And so when we look at, not just this generation, but the next generation, our kids and our grandkids, it's incumbent upon us to strip away all of this crap that confuses our young people. We look, and I've heard plenty of people say, look, I've exposed all my children to different belief systems so they can choose. I didn't. I'd be damned if I was going to try to teach Catholicism or Christianity to my children and then what? Offer some alternative belief system? No, to hell with that. Look, there is something that is absolutely pragmatic and useful in the way Native people lived. It had to be, because we didn't live off of oppression. If you live off of oppression, you have to create these constructs that not only support oppressing other people, but will confine the oppressed into accepting their lot in life. I mean, it's like this idea of a caste system didn't just exist in India, in Indian culture. The entire system of Christianity and hierarchy is a caste system. There were the royals, and then there was the whole feudal systems of Europe were based on look, you're stuck where you were born. And that's where they suggested the ambition to rise above your class in your social class was considered a sin in Europe. I mean, and of course, the idea of sin came from went right along with their belief system. But you see, our system didn't, our ideas, our culture, and our relationship to creation was not based on us being somehow elevated above all of the rest of creation. That's what we should be enlightening our children to. That we have a relationship even with those stars. And we can determine as we live our lives what exactly that relationship is. Maybe that relationship is just about inspiration, not just about guidance or navigation as some have used it. But we all view things differently. We view beauty differently. And so what we are inspired from what we witness can be different individual to individual. But the fact that we can and should be inspired by what nature what creation has provided is something that we should encourage. Look, the greatest thing about creation is that it renews, and that we oftentimes can find something new in in something that has been around since the beginning of time. So this idea of encouraging our young people is encouraging them to be inspired by creation in ways that perhaps we didn't or we weren't. We have to look to our children to advance issues, to advance us as a people. Look, I believe in evolution, but I don't think evolution is tied to this idea of civilization. I think that is another control mechanism. I think evolution is about further developing and understanding your relationship to creation, to nature, and living the highest quality of life that doesn't require you taking away somebody else's quality of life. That is what, to me, is what evolution is. How do you live a life that is rich and fulfilling, that fulfills not only your bodily needs but your mental needs? You don't do that by oppressing and conforming and trying to squeeze the brain into believing something that is simply unprovable. That's the challenge that we have. So, like I said, this is not a story, or this is not a show about spirituality. This is a show that, if anything, refutes what most people would how most people would characterize spirituality. I mean, when people ask me, "Are you a spiritual person?" on its face, I have to say no, because I already have an idea what some people are viewing as spirituality. When I hear these New Agers say, "Oh, I just love your culture; it's so spiritual," when I hear people say that to me, that's troublesome, because they've already kind of tried to separate the pragmatic nature of what our ceremonies were, what our lives were, how we sustained ourselves, how we taught our children, how we lived, how we extended our family beyond mom, dad, and 2.5 kids. That to me was unnatural. The way most of urban living, to me, is the most unnatural construct of all. And I'm not saying that we didn't go down that path as indigenous people. We did. We built cities. And most of those cities perished long before white men showed up because they were unsustainable. And the idea of creating something that's unsustainable is defying nature. And even when indigenous people did it, it didn't make it right, and it didn't make it successful. Look, we, in many ways, have tried to harness some elements of nature's power of creation, to make our lives better. But harnessing it and thinking that you can actually own it and control it. I mean, the idea of damming up a river has consequences. It doesn't, people think, oh, we can do flood control. Well, how has that worked out? As we look across our homelands, our ancestral lands, Turtle Island, you show me over the long haul how any manipulation, anything that was built to defy nature, has been successful. And look, I'll take those those comments, because at the end of the day, we will see over and over again how the more that we have defied nature, even in the name of Christianity and in the name of God, and God blessing America, we're going to find out. Look, we're at a time now where I challenge anybody to show me how much God has blessed this country. This country is at a pivotal point, and I don't care how many evangelicals, I don't care how many Catholics the right puts on the Supreme Court. Yeah, there's a concept for you. Ever notice how there's been very few Catholic presidents of the United States? Why? Because most of this country was founded on rejecting the power and authority of the Catholic Church. And that's why Anglo-Saxon Protestants, dominated the United States. However, even the non-Catholic leaders of the United States, when they want to choose somebody who's going to judge other people, and they will oftentimes gravitate towards Catholics. Not just this Coney Barrett woman, but Scalia, Roberts. I mean, probably even Sotomayor. I mean, look, there's a desire to pull in some the most authoritarian Christian belief, people of the most authoritarian Christian belief, which is Catholicism, and put them on a court to judge people for a lifetime appointment. There's something a little creepy about that too. And but again, we're going to see in this next several years how Americans are going to deal with this stuff. But at the same time, we should not just be bystanders. I think we should be spectators, but we should be active spectators. We should know what we're seeing. And we should prepare ourselves by not being clouded with this notion of spirituality and that God. I mean, when I hear people talk about voting and praying, why would this all-powerful being somehow answer a prayer today when they weren't answering the prayers as our kids were being beaten and killed and abused by churches running residential schools? Why should this all-powerful being, this God of gods, King of kings, why should he hear our pleas now when they were murdering us? They were massacring us. When slavery would exist in a way that defied nature. It defied everything that anybody of any level of morality could say was proper and right. And we think we're going to pray our way out of problems now? Look, even at Standing Rock, when I heard people say, well, let's pray for those judges who are going to hear the cases associated with this. Let's pray for the politicians. Are you freaking kidding me? I'll tell you what prayer is. Prayer is an excuse for doing nothing. It's an excuse against doing something. And I honestly view voting in much the same way. We are responsible for our lives. Our lives have not been charted out by some man in the sky. And nothing in our culture suggests that that's true. We have responsibilities, and again, my friend Dagarundige talks about that we were given a brain. We were given the power of reason so we could take into account so much more than perhaps other creatures on the planet could do. And we've been given this ability to reason and to observe and to adapt our lives based on the lives around us. Not to defy nature, but to live with it. That lies at the core of what Native identity always has been, but has been mired in confusion over the last couple of hundred years. Since the moment white men came onto our lands and began trying to displace everything that we knew, all of our knowledge, and strip that away, call it paganism, call it devil worship, and indoctrinate us into their culture of domination. So I guess my warning to everybody is think about what the words you say mean and mean them. Make sure that when you speak from a place that is not somebody else's words that were put in your mouth or somebody else's ideas that were put into your head. Let your own reason, your own vision, and your own senses guide you. And let common sense be one of those senses. Look, I gotta thank you guys for listening. We'll be back for our next program. We'll see you then. And thanks again for listening and for watching. Yahweh.